The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. as David finished mopping the last section of the hotel lobby floor. His back ached from the long shift, and his hands were rough from hours of cleaning and maintenance work. At 28 years old, he had been working at the Grand Plaza Hotel for almost 3 years now, taking care of everything from fixing broken faucets to changing light bulbs in the fancy chandeliers. The hotel lobby was quiet at this hour. Most guests were either sleeping or out enjoying the city's nightlife. Only a few people sat in the comfortable leather chairs, reading newspapers or checking their phones. The night desk clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, was busy with some paperwork behind the reception counter. She had become like a mother figure to David over the years, always asking about his day and making sure he took proper breaks. David pushed his cleaning cart to the storage room and locked it away. As he walked back through the lobby, something caught his eye. There, sitting in the corner like a sleeping giant, was the beautiful black grand piano. The hotel management had placed it there 2 years ago to give the lobby a more elegant feel. During the day, sometimes a professional pianist would play soft music for the guests, but at night it sat silent and alone. David had always been drawn to that piano. As a child growing up in different foster homes, he had dreamed of learning to play, but there was never enough money for lessons or even a small keyboard. He remembered pressing his nose against the window of a music store when he was 12, watching a teacher give piano lessons to a young girl. The way her fingers danced across the keys seemed magical to him. 3 months ago, David had discovered something amazing. The hotel had free Wi-Fi, and during his lunch breaks he started watching piano tutorial videos on his phone. He learned about the black and white keys, about scales and chords, about how to read basic music. The more he watched, the more his fingers itched to try playing for real. One night, about 2 months ago, David had been working late when he noticed. The lobby was completely empty except for Mrs. Rodriguez at the front desk. She was busy with inventory and had her headphones on. David looked around nervously, then walked over to the piano. He lifted the heavy lid carefully and sat down on the bench. His heart was beating fast as he pressed down on middle C, the first note he had learned about from the videos. The sound was beautiful. Clear and pure, it filled the marble lobby with a gentle echo. David pressed a few more keys, trying to remember the simple scales he had memorized. To his surprise, Mrs. Rodriguez looked up and smiled at him. She walked over and whispered, "You know, the manager told me that piano needs to be played regularly to stay in tune. As long as you keep it quiet and don't disturb the guests, I think it's fine." That night changed everything for David. He started coming down to the lobby during his breaks, usually around midnight when things were quietest. He would sit at the piano and practice the simple songs he had learned from YouTube videos. His rough, work-worn hands weren't meant for delicate piano playing, but somehow they found their way around the keys. At first, he could only play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Happy Birthday. But David was determined. Every night he would practice for 20 or 30 minutes. He taught himself Für Elise by Beethoven 1 note at a time. It took him 3 weeks to play it without mistakes. But when he finally did, Mrs. Rodriguez actually stopped her work to listen. Tonight was different, though. David had been practicing a new piece for the past 2 weeks. It was Chopin's Nocturne in F-flat major, one of the most beautiful piano pieces ever written. He had found a slow tutorial video that broke down every single note, and he had been practicing small sections during each break. As David sat down at the piano bench tonight, he felt more confident than usual. His fingers found the keys naturally now, and he didn't have to think so hard about where to place them. The lobby was peaceful, with only the soft sound of the air conditioning and the distant hum of traffic outside. He began to play the opening notes of the Nocturne. The melody was sad and beautiful at the same time, like someone remembering a happy memory from long ago. David had watched the tutorial video so many times that he could hear the instructor's voice in his head, guiding him through each phrase. As he played, David felt something he had never experienced before. It was like the music was coming from somewhere deep inside him, not just from his fingers pressing keys. All the loneliness of growing up without a real family, all the tiredness from working long hours, all the dreams he had kept hidden in his heart, Everything seemed to flow out through the piano. The marble lobby had perfect acoustics, and every note seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading away. David closed his eyes and let the music carry him away from the late-night hotel shift, away from the mop and the cleaning supplies, away from everything except the beauty of the moment. He didn't notice that Mrs. Rodriguez had stopped working and was listening with tears in her eyes. He didn't see the young couple who had come down from their room to get some ice and were now standing frozen by the elevator, amazed by what they were hearing. He didn't notice the taxi driver who had stopped outside the hotel's big windows and was pressing his face against the glass, trying to see who was making such beautiful music. But most importantly, David didn't notice the elderly gentleman in the expensive gray suit who had just walked into the lobby 10 minutes ago. The man had been heading toward the front desk to ask about extending his stay, but when he heard the piano music, he stopped walking. He stood there for a moment, listening, and then slowly walked to one of the leather armchairs positioned behind the piano. The gentleman sat down carefully, his eyes focused on the young man at the piano. His face showed surprise, then interest, then something deeper, recognition of real talent. This wasn't just someone playing notes. This was someone who understood the soul of the music, even if he didn't know it himself. As David continued playing, completely lost in the music, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that his midnight piano sessions had been noticed by someone who would recognize his gift and help him discover a future he had never dared to dream of. The night was still young, and the most extraordinary part of this story was just beginning. David continued playing the nocturne, his fingers moving more smoothly across the keys than they ever had before. Something felt different tonight. Maybe it was because he had been practicing this piece for 2 weeks straight, or maybe it was the peaceful atmosphere of the late-night lobby, but the music seemed to be flowing out of him naturally. As he played, David found himself thinking about his childhood. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting in his second foster home, watching an old movie on television. There was a scene where a man played piano in a fancy restaurant and everyone stopped talking to listen. Even as a little boy, David had wondered what it would feel like to create something so beautiful that people would stop everything just to hear it. The elderly gentleman in the gray suit settled into the leather armchair about 15 feet behind the piano. From where David was sitting, he could barely see the man in his peripheral vision. The stranger looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair neatly combed back and kind eyes that seemed to hold many stories. His clothes were clearly expensive, the kind of suit that cost more than David made in 2 months, but there was something else about this man that David couldn't quite put his finger on. The way he sat perfectly still, the way he closed his eyes and tilted his head slightly to the left while listening, it reminded David of the classical music videos he watched online. The conductors and musicians in those videos had the same look of deep concentration and understanding. The man didn't fidget with his phone like most hotel guests did. He didn't check his watch or look around the lobby. He simply sat there, completely absorbed in the music, as if nothing else in the world mattered at that moment. David had noticed this same gentleman 3 nights ago, though he hadn't thought much about it at the time. The man had been sitting in a different chair then, closer to the hotel's restaurant entrance. 2 nights ago, he had been near the elevator, reading a newspaper, and last night, he had been on the other side of the lobby, talking quietly on his phone. But tonight was different. Tonight, the gentleman seemed to have chosen his seat deliberately, positioning himself where he could hear the piano perfectly. David wondered if the man was having trouble sleeping or if he was waiting for someone. Many hotel guests came down to the lobby late at night. Some couldn't sleep, others were waiting for delayed flights, and some just enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. As David moved into the more challenging part of the nocturne, he noticed something remarkable happening. The music seemed to be creating a bubble of calm around him. Mrs. Rodriguez had stopped typing on her computer and was listening with a soft smile on her face. The young couple who had come downstairs for ice were now sitting on the small sofa, near the window, holding hands and listening as if they were at a concert. Even the night security guard Mr. Thompson had appeared from wherever he usually spent his time. He was a big, tough-looking man who rarely smiled, but tonight he was leaning against the wall near the front desk, his arms crossed, listening with an expression of wonder on his face. David had never had an audience before, not really. Sometimes Mrs. Rodriguez would listen for a few minutes, or a guest would pause while walking through the lobby, but this felt different. It felt like these people had chosen to be here, chosen to listen, chosen to be part of this moment. The elderly gentleman seemed to be the most focused listener of all. David noticed that the man's breathing had slowed down, and his hands were resting on the arms of the chair in a way that suggested he was completely relaxed. Once or twice, David saw the man nod slightly, as if he approved of a particular phrase. Oh, the way David had handled a difficult passage. This made David both nervous and excited. He had been playing piano for only a few months, learning everything from free YouTube videos on his phone. He knew he wasn't perfect. He knew he made mistakes, and he knew that real pianists probably played this piece much better than he did. But something about the way this gentleman was listening made David feel like his music mattered. As he played, David began to notice small details about his mysterious audience member. The man's shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His fingers were long and elegant, with calluses on the tips that David recognized from his own hands, the kind of calluses that came from years of pressing piano keys. There was a small pin on the man's lapel that David couldn't quite see clearly, but it looked like it might be some kind of musical symbol. The most interesting thing about the gentleman was his expression. His eyes were closed, but his face showed deep emotion. Sometimes he would smile slightly during the more beautiful passages, and other times his eyebrows would furrow during the more complex sections, as if he was following every note and understanding exactly what David was trying to express. David had seen this kind of expression before in the classical music videos he watched online. It was the way professional musicians looked when they were listening to something that truly moved them. It was the way conductors looked when their orchestra was playing perfectly. It was the way piano teachers looked when their students finally understood a difficult piece, but this was just a hotel lobby at midnight, and David was just a maintenance worker who had taught himself to play piano from YouTube videos. Why would this distinguished gentleman be listening to him with such intense focus and appreciation? As David continued playing, he found himself trying to play even better than usual. Not showing off, but putting extra care into every note, extra feeling into every phrase. He wanted to give this patient, mysterious listener the best performance he could manage. The nocturne was a long piece, and David had been playing for almost 15 minutes now. His fingers were starting to get a little tired, but he didn't want to stop. This moment felt special, even though he didn't fully understand why. The gentleman had been sitting perfectly still for the entire performance. But now David noticed something new. The man's lips were moving slightly, as if he was humming along or perhaps even remembering the words to a song that went with this melody. It was such a small thing, but it made David feel like this person truly understood the music he was playing. David had never felt so connected to his music before. Usually, when he played alone in the lobby, it was just him and the piano. But tonight it felt like he was sharing something important with this quiet, mysterious stranger. It felt like they were both part of something bigger than just a late night. Hotel lobby performance. As the piece continued, David began to realize that this elderly gentleman might be more than just a regular hotel guest. There was something about the way he listened, something about his obvious appreciation for classical music, something about the expensive clothes and the careful way he carried himself that suggested he might be someone special, but David was too focused on his playing to think about it too much. All he knew was that he had never played better than he was playing right now, and he had never felt more grateful for the strange path that had led him to this piano, to this moment, to this mysterious audience of one. As David reached the final section of the nocturne, he decided to challenge himself. He had been watching YouTube tutorials for a more complex piece by Rachmaninoff for the past week, even though he knew it was probably too advanced for his skill level. The piece was called Piano Concerto No. 2, And just the opening section had taken him hours to learn properly. Something about tonight made him feel brave. Maybe it was the peaceful atmosphere, or maybe it was the way his mysterious listener sat so still and focused. David had never attempted to play this piece in front of anyone before, not even Mrs. Rodriguez. He had only practiced it during his lunch breaks when the lobby was busy and no one could hear him clearly, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the right time to try something new. David finished the nocturne with a soft, gentle ending that seemed to float in the air for a moment before fading away. The lobby was completely quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Then, without pausing, David began the opening notes of the Rachmaninoff piece. The first few notes were deep and dramatic, completely different from the gentle Chopin he had just finished. David's left hand played powerful bass notes while his right hand began a melody that seemed to climb higher and higher, like someone reaching toward the sky. As soon as he began playing, David noticed something change in his elderly listener. The man's eyes opened for the first time since he had sat down, and he leaned forward slightly in his chair. His expression went from peaceful appreciation to something that looked almost like surprise. David was concentrating so hard on the difficult piece that he didn't notice other people starting to gather in the lobby. Mrs. Rodriguez had stood up from her desk and was walking closer to the piano. The young couple by the window had stopped whispering to each other and were now watching David's hands move across the keys with amazement. Mr. Thompson, the security guard, had been joined by 2 other hotel staff members who must have finished their shifts. They were all standing near the reception desk, listening with expressions of wonder. One of them was holding her phone, as if she was thinking about recording this unexpected late-night concert. But the most interesting reaction came from the elderly gentleman in the gray suit. As David played the challenging Rachmaninoff piece, the man's face showed a mixture of emotions that David couldn't quite understand. There was surprise, yes, but also something that looked like recognition. The man's hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, were now moving slightly, as if he was conducting an invisible orchestra. David had practiced this piece so many times that his fingers knew where to go, but it was still incredibly difficult. There were sections where both hands had to play rapid, complex passages at the same time. There were moments where he had to stretch his fingers across many keys simultaneously. It was the kind of piece that professional pianists spent years perfecting. As David played, he began to notice something strange happening around him. The lobby had become much quieter than usual. Even the normal sounds of the hotel, the ding of the elevator, the quiet conversations at the front desk, the footsteps of guests walking through, everything seemed to have stopped. More people were gathering to listen. David could see them in his peripheral vision, but he was too focused on the music to look around properly. There was a middle-aged woman in a hotel bathrobe who must have come down from her room. There was a man in a business suit who looked like he had just arrived from the airport. There was even a taxi driver who had apparently come inside from the street, but David's attention kept being drawn back to the elderly gentleman. The man was now sitting on the edge of his chair, his body language completely changed from the relaxed posture he had maintained during the Chopin piece. His eyes were fixed on David's hands, and his expression was becoming more and more intense. David began to feel nervous. He had never played this piece for anyone before, and he knew he wasn't playing it perfectly. There were a few notes that he missed, a few sections where his timing wasn't quite right. He was just a maintenance worker who had learned to play piano from YouTube videos. What was he doing attempting such a complex piece in front of all these people? But something amazing was happening. Even with his mistakes, even with his imperfect technique, the music was still beautiful. The powerful melody seemed to fill the entire lobby, and David could feel the emotion of the piece flowing through him and out into the room. The elderly gentleman was now leaning forward even more, and David could see his face more clearly. The man had sharp, intelligent eyes and a face that seemed familiar somehow, though David was sure he had never met him before. There was something about the way he was listening, something about the intensity of his focus, that made David think this person understood music in a way that most people didn't. As David continued playing, He noticed that the man's lips were moving again, but this time it was different. It looked like he was saying something, maybe commenting on the music or perhaps even humming along with parts that David was playing differently than expected. The strangest thing was that the gentleman didn't look confused or critical when David made mistakes. Instead, he looked impressed. It was hard to tell, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was hearing something special, something that went beyond technical perfection. David had learned from his YouTube piano teachers that music wasn't just about playing the notes correctly. It was about feeling, about emotion, about telling a story through sound. And tonight, as he played this challenging piece in front of this mysterious audience, David felt like he was finally understanding what that meant. The piece was building to its most difficult section, a part where both hands had to play incredibly fast and complex passages simultaneously. David had only managed to play it correctly a few times during his practice sessions. His heart was beating faster as he approached this section, knowing that he might make mistakes, but as he began the challenging passage, something incredible happened. The elderly gentleman stood up from his chair. He didn't stand up to leave. He didn't stand up because he was uncomfortable. He stood up the way people stand up at concerts when they're so moved by the music that they can't remain seated. He stood up with his eyes still fixed on David's hands, with an expression of complete amazement on his face. David's fingers were flying across the keys now, playing the fastest and most complex part of the piece. His left hand was playing deep, powerful chords while his right hand played a melody that seemed to dance and leap across the higher notes. It was the most challenging thing he had ever attempted, and somehow, miraculously, he was managing to play it. The lobby had become completely silent except for the sound of the piano. Even the normal background noises of the hotel seemed to have stopped. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, listening to this unexpected performance by a maintenance worker who had taught himself to play piano from YouTube videos, and standing there watching with an expression of complete wonder and growing recognition was the elderly gentleman whose presence had somehow inspired David to play better than he had ever played before. David had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that the man standing behind him was someone who would recognize his talent and help him discover a future he had never dared to imagine. All David knew was that he was playing the most beautiful music he had ever created, and for the first time in his life he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. David was so focused on the challenging Rachmaninoff piece that he almost missed the whispers starting behind him. As his fingers moved across the keys, playing the most complex passage he had ever attempted, he heard someone say something that made his heart skip a beat. "Wait a minute," a woman's voice whispered. "Is that ... Is that really him?" David's concentration wavered for just a moment. He glanced back quickly and saw that the lobby had filled with more people than he had realized. There were at least 15 people now, all standing in a loose circle around the piano area. Some were hotel staff, some were guests, and some looked like they had come in from the street, but it was what happened next that made David's fingers almost stumble on the keys. Mrs. Rodriguez had walked closer to get a better look at the elderly gentleman, and suddenly her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide with shock, and she turned to whisper something urgently to Mr. Thompson, the security guard. David saw Mr. Thompson's expression change from casual interest to complete amazement. The big man's mouth actually fell open, and he stared at the elderly gentleman like he was seeing a ghost. "No way," Mr. Thompson whispered, loud enough for David to hear. That's actually him. That's really him." David tried to keep playing, but his mind was racing. Who was this man? What was so special about him that grown adults were reacting like they had just seen a famous movie star? The taxi driver who had come in from the street was now holding his phone up, not to record David's playing, but to take a picture of the elderly gentleman. But he was being very careful about it, like he didn't want to disturb something important. "I can't believe it," the taxi driver whispered to the person next to him. "I've been driving in this city for 20 years, and I've never seen him in person. My wife is never going to believe this." David was still playing, but his mind was spinning. He had never seen people react this way to anyone before. The elderly gentleman was just standing there, listening to the music with that same intense focus he had shown all evening. But everyone around him was acting like they were in the presence of someone incredibly important. A young woman who worked at the hotel's restaurant had joined the group. She was staring at the elderly gentleman with tears in her eyes. "He's the reason I started playing piano," she whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I had his albums when I was a little girl. I can't believe. He's really here, albums?" David's fingers kept moving across the keys, but his mind was trying to process what he was hearing. This man had albums. That meant he was a musician. But not just any musician, he was someone famous enough that people recognized him on sight. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in David's mind. The way the man listened to music with such deep understanding, the way he sat perfectly still, completely absorbed in every note, the calluses on his fingertips that David had noticed earlier, the way his hands moved slightly as if he was conducting an invisible orchestra. This wasn't just a hotel guest who enjoyed classical music. This was someone who knew music professionally, someone who understood every complex passage David was playing, every subtle emotion he was trying to express. As David continued playing, he noticed that the elderly gentleman's reaction was different from everyone else's. While the crowd around him was whispering and staring, the man himself remained focused entirely on the music. His eyes were still fixed on David's hands, his expression still showing that same intense appreciation he had displayed all evening. But now David could see something else in the man's face. It was a look of genuine surprise, not at being recognized by the crowd, but at what he was hearing from the piano. It was the look of someone who had spent his entire life around music, someone who had heard the world's greatest pianists perform, and who was now hearing something that truly amazed him. David was nearing the end of the Rachmaninoff piece now, approaching the powerful, dramatic conclusion. His hands were tired, his fingers were starting to ache, but he was determined to finish strong. This was the most important performance of his life. Even though he still didn't fully understand why. As he played the final complex passages, David heard more whispers from the crowd. "He's been coming here for 3 nights, someone was saying. "I saw him yesterday, just sitting and listening, but why here?" Another voice asked, "Why would he come to a hotel lobby instead of a concert hall?" "Look at how he's watching that young man play," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered. "He's not just listening, he's studying every move." David's heart was pounding now, and not just from the physical effort of playing such a challenging piece. He was beginning to understand that this elderly gentleman wasn't just any music lover. He was someone important in the world of classical music, someone whose presence in this hotel lobby was so unexpected that it was shocking the people who recognized him. The realization made David both nervous and excited. He had been playing for someone who truly understood music at the highest level, someone who could recognize real talent when he heard it, someone who knew the difference between a skilled amateur and something more special. As David played the final, thunderous chords of the Rachmaninoff piece, he put everything he had into those last few notes. All his dreams of making beautiful music, all his years of wondering what it would be like to really play piano, all his hope that maybe, just maybe, he had some real talent, everything went into those final moments. The last note rang out across the marble lobby, echoing off the high ceiling and slowly fading into silence. David's hands remained on the keys for a moment, his breathing heavy from the effort of the performance. The lobby was completely quiet. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the normal sounds of the hotel seemed to have stopped. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the elderly gentleman began to clap. It wasn't the polite, automatic applause that people usually give after a performance. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with genuine appreciation. Each clap seemed to carry weight, as if it meant something more than just approval. As soon as the elderly gentleman started clapping, everyone else in the lobby joined in, but their applause was different too. It wasn't just appreciation for David's playing, it was amazement at what they were witnessing. They were watching someone who was clearly a master of music, showing genuine respect and admiration for a hotel maintenance worker who had taught himself to play piano from YouTube videos. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but David barely heard it. He was turning around on the piano bench, finally getting his first clear look at the man who had been his mysterious audience. The elderly gentleman was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and kind but sharp eyes. He was wearing an expensive suit, but there was something about him that suggested he was more comfortable in concert halls than hotel lobbies. His hands, which were still clapping, were clearly the hands of a pianist, long, elegant fingers with the telltale calluses that came from decades of playing, but it was the man's expression that struck David the most. It wasn't the look of someone who was just being polite or who had enjoyed a nice performance. It was the look of someone who had discovered something remarkable, something unexpected, something that had genuinely moved him. As the applause began to die down, the elderly gentleman took a step forward. He was smiling now, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up his entire face. David's hands were shaking slightly as he stood up from the piano bench. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew that this moment would change his life forever. As the elderly gentleman walked closer to the piano, David felt his heart beating so fast he was sure everyone in the lobby could hear it. The man moved with quiet dignity, his expensive shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. When he reached the piano bench, he stopped and looked directly into David's eyes. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that David couldn't quite place. "That was extraordinary." David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had never been this nervous in his entire life. The man standing in front of him was clearly someone very important, someone who understood music at a level David could barely imagine. I'm sorry if I disturbed you," David finally managed to say. "I know I'm not supposed to be playing during work hours, but Mrs. Rodriguez said it was okay, and I just love music so much, and I've been teaching myself from YouTube videos and ... The elderly gentleman held up a gentle hand, stopping David's nervous rambling. "Please, don't apologize. What you just played was beautiful. Tell me, how long have you been playing piano?" "About 3 months," David said quietly, feeling embarrassed. "I know I'm not very good. I make a lot of mistakes and I've never had real lessons. I just watch videos on my phone during lunch breaks." The man's eyebrows raised in surprise. 3 months? You've been playing for only 3 months? David nodded, suddenly feeling very small under the intense gaze of this distinguished stranger. Around them, the crowd of people was still gathered, listening to every word but trying to be respectful and not interrupt. "That's impossible," the elderly gentleman said softly, more to himself than to David. "The way you played that Rachmaninoff piece, the feeling you put into the Chopin ... that's not something you can learn from videos in 3 months." David wasn't sure how to respond. He had always felt like there was something inside him that connected with music in a way he couldn't explain. When he played piano, it felt like he was speaking a language he had always known but never had a chance to use. "What's your name, young man?" the elderly gentleman asked. "David," he replied. "David Chun. I work maintenance here at the hotel." The man smiled warmly. "David, my name is Professor Alexander Petrov. I teach at the Moscow Conservatory, but I've been living in New York for the past 5 years. I'm here in the city for a concert tomorrow night." David's eyes widened. Moscow Conservatory? That was one of the most famous music schools in the world. David had seen videos of students from that school playing in competitions, and they were incredible. And this man was a professor there? "I've been staying at this hotel for 3 nights, Professor Petrov continued, "and each night I've come down here to listen to you play. At first I thought you might be a music student practicing, but when I asked at the front desk, they told me you work here and that you taught yourself to play." Mrs. Rodriguez had been listening from behind the reception desk, and now she stepped forward, Professor, I've been watching David play for 2 months now. Every night he gets better and better. I've never seen anything like it, Professor Petrov nodded. Neither have I, David. Do you know who Rachmaninoff was? Yes, sir. He was a Russian composer and pianist. He lived from 1873 to 1943, and he wrote some of the most beautiful and challenging piano music ever created. That's correct. And the piece you just played, know how difficult it is? David shook his head. I just knew it was hard to learn. It took me a week to get through the first page. Professor Petrov smiled. David, that piece is considered one of the most challenging in the entire piano repertoire. Professional pianists spend years learning to play it properly. Graduate students at the world's best music schools struggle with it. And you learned it in a week from YouTube videos. The crowd around them was completely silent now, hanging on every word. David could see that some people were recording the conversation on their phones, but he was too overwhelmed to care. But I made mistakes, David said. I could hear them. My timing wasn't perfect in some places. Yes, you made some technical errors, Professor Petrov agreed. But David, technique can be taught. What you have, the musicality, the feeling, the natural understanding of how music should sound, that cannot be taught. That is a gift. David felt tears starting to form in his eyes. No one had ever talked to him about having a gift for anything. He had spent his whole life just trying to get by, working whatever jobs he could find, never thinking he might be special at something. Professor, David said quietly, I've always loved music, but I never thought I could be good at it. I never had money for lessons or even a piano to practice on. I just I just love the way it makes me feel. Professor Petrov's expression grew more serious. David, I need to ask you something important. What are your plans for the future? Are you happy working at the hotel? David looked around at the lobby, at Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been so kind to him, at the job that had given him stability for the past 3 years. I'm grateful for this job, he said honestly. But if I'm being completely honest, I dream about music every day. I dream about playing piano in front of people who love music as much as I do. I dream about learning more pieces, about getting better, about maybe someday playing in a real concert hall. David, Professor Petrov said, his voice filled with emotion, I want to help you make those dreams come true. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. David stared at the professor, not sure he had heard correctly. I've been teaching piano for 40 years, Professor Petrov continued. I've worked with some of the most talented young musicians in the world. But I have never, ever encountered someone with your natural ability. The way you play, the way you understand music instinctively, it's extraordinary. David's hands were shaking now. What do you mean? I mean that I want to offer you a full scholarship to study at the Moscow Conservatory. I want to personally mentor you, to help you develop your gift properly. I want to introduce you to the world of professional classical music. The crowd around them erupted in whispers and gasps. David felt like he might faint. A full scholarship to one of the world's most prestigious music schools? Personal mentoring from a master teacher? It seemed too good to be true. But Professor, David said, his voice barely a whisper, I don't have any formal training. I don't even know how to read music properly. I just play by ear. Professor Petrov smiled. David, most of my students come to me with years of technical training but no soul in their playing. You have something much more valuable. You have a natural musicality that cannot be taught. Everything else we can work on together. David looked around the lobby at all the faces watching him. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying happy tears. Mr. Thompson was grinning like he had just witnessed a miracle. The other hotel staff members were clapping quietly, celebrating this amazing turn of events. This is really happening? David asked, still unable to believe it. This is really happening, Professor Petrov confirmed. David, you have a gift that the world needs to hear. All you need is the proper training to share it. Will you let me help you? David thought about his childhood dreams of playing piano, about all the nights he had practiced in this quiet hotel lobby, about the music that had always lived in his heart but had never had a proper way to come out. "Yes," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Yes, I would be honored to study with you." Professor Petrov reached out and shook David's hand. "Then we begin tomorrow. Tonight you changed from a hotel maintenance worker into a music student. Your real journey is just beginning." As David looked around at the smiling faces in the lobby, he realized that his life had just changed forever. All because he had dared to sit down at a piano and play the music that lived in his heart.